It's an early morning of June 7th, 2023. After Ukrainian artillery intensifies strikes on dug-in Russian forces, the offensive, announced a long time ago, enters its crucial phase. Ukrainians jump into their newly acquired Leopard 2A6 tanks, M2 Bradleys and other armored mine-clearing and mobility vehicles to form columns and cut through Russian minefields and defenses. Understanding all the responsibility and complexity of the task, the soldiers of the recently formed 47th Mechanized Brigade are optimistic about their chances of completing the mission. However, heading towards the village of Robotyne, they're about to face immense resistance, not even closely resembled, during their months of training in Western countries. Going back in time, Ukraine gathered a potent force of 12 new brigades for its 2023 counteroffensive, breaking them into three major groups that have their own directions of attack. Assisted with other forces, the group in size is estimated to be around 60,000. This decision was quite controversial, and the United States advised against it, suggesting focusing efforts on the narrow part of the front line. However, the Ukrainian command tries to make Russians spread their quantitatively superior forces to have a better chance to utilize the qualitative advantage. Near the Dnipro River, Ukrainians deploy the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, as well as the 2nd Separate Rifle, 130th Separate Reconnaissance, and Terror battalions to conduct an auxiliary attack towards Vasilievka. 71st Yager Brigade is in reserve, near Orikhiv, where the main attack in the direction of Robotyne, then Tokmak, and finally Melitopol must be executed. Ukrainians deploy mostly the forces of its new 10th Operational Corps, 47th and 33rd Mechanized Brigades, armed with Leopard 2 tanks and Bradley IMVs, with the only goal: pry open Russian defensive lines and wreak havoc among the enemy in the same way as during Kharkiv counteroffensive. Supported by the 3rd, 11th and 15th Advance Guard, as well as 43rd, 44th and 47th Artillery Brigades, the 47th and 33rd's initial breakthrough has to be further exploited by the reserves. These are the experienced 82nd Air Assault Brigade, armed with Challenger 2s, Marders and Strikers, 46th Air Mobile, and elements of the new 65th, 116th, 117th and 118th Mechanized Brigades. The other supporting forces include the 113th Separate Recon Battalion and elements of the Azov Brigade. The position to the east are defended by the 108th and 102nd Territorial Defense Brigades, with the support of the 78th Separate Battalion of the Territorial Defense and 45th Artillery Brigade. Ukrainians plan another push in the area of Velika Novosilka, mostly with forces of almost the entire Ukraine Marine Corps, represented by the 35th, 36th, 37th and 38th Marine Brigades. With assistance provided by the Battalion of Ukrainian Volunteer Army, 23rd and 31st Mechanized, 110th, 129th Territorial Defense, 1st, 4th Tank, 68th Yager, 15th Artillery Reconnaissance and 55th Artillery Brigades, as well as the 74th Reconnaissance Battalion, Ukrainians here plan to advance towards Mariupol. Positions around Vuhledar are held by the 72nd Mechanized Brigade. Another axis of advance is recently captured by Russians, Bakhmut. After the dissolution of PMC Wagner, the pace of the Russian advance diminished there, so Ukrainians plan to seize the initiative, attacking with forces of the 3rd, 5th, Lutte Assault and 80th Air Assault Brigades from the south. However, these efforts are rather a diversionary attack to tie up in battles as many Russian forces as possible, and as far as possible from the primary Tokmak direction. Here, Russians mainly concentrated the 72nd, 57th and former LPR's 4th Separate Motor Rifle Brigades, as well as Storm V unit, recruited out of the prisoners, with attached to it blocking unit of the Russian National Guard, Akhmat, deployed to prevent its voluntary and involuntary retreat. The second echelon is formed out of the 51st Parachute Regiment of the 106th Airborne Division, 11th, 31st and 83rd Air Assault Brigades as rapid reaction forces. To the south, the 155th Marine, 14th Spetsnaz and 36th Motor Rifle Brigades continued to hold positions near Vuhledar after numerous unsuccessful assaults. To the south of Velika Novosilka, Russians deployed the 40th, 336th Marine, 37th, 60th, 136th and former DPR's 110th Separate Motor Rifle, 5th Tank, 34th Mountain and 305th Artillery Brigades, 71st Motor Rifle Regiment of the 42nd Motor Rifle Division and 6 different motor rifle regiments of the 127th Motor Rifle Division, 247th Air Assault Regiment of the 7th Mountain Air Assault Division, as well as former DPR's Cascade unit. To the west, Russians deploy elements of the 64th, 69th, and 38th separate motor rifle brigades. In the direction of the main Ukrainian attack, they field 3 echelons of well-prepared defensive lines, with forces of the 70th, 291st, 1430th Motor Rifle Regiments, and 417th Recon Battalion of the 42nd Motor Rifle Division, and 503rd Motor Rifle Regiment from the 19th Motor Rifle Division, 177th Marine Regiment from the Caspian Flotilla, 22nd and 45th Spetsnaz Brigades. Supported by the 291st Artillery Brigade, this grouping seems small, but they enjoy quite a few advantages over the adversary. The vast minefields ensure that Ukrainians would not be able to maneuver. Hundreds of kilometers of trenches are filled with thousands of men and supplied with ATGMs to counter specifically the mechanized assault. Russians have managed to overcome communication problems and reconnaissance drone shortages with the help of China on this part of the front line, so they will not be only fully aware where the attack begins, but also can effectively direct strikes of friendly artillery, attack aviation, and loitering munitions. Inevitable losses are to be restored with Bar's reservist units, as well as dozens of extra regiments that hold 2nd and 3rd defensive lines, including air assault forces, for hardest missions, and blocking the retreat. To the west, Russians expect a diversionary attack, so they plan to defend positions with Bar's Crimea, former DPR's 125th Regiment, and 429th Motor Rifle Regiment of the 19th Motor Rifle Division, as well as Sudoplatov's and Alanya Volunteer Battalions and Penal Battalion Storm Ossetia, all these under the careful supervision of the 45th Spetsnaz Brigade. The number of Russian forces on the southern front, by some crude estimates, is somewhere between 70 and 150,000. On June 4th, Ukrainians who postponed the active phase of the counteroffensive for quite some time to receive as much equipment from allies as possible start probing the Russian defenses. The column of 2 T-64 BV tanks and 6 Max Prom RAPs of the 23rd Mechanized Brigade attack Russian positions in the area of village of Novodarivka. The Russians react quickly, managing to spot the column with a drone and calling for a TGM, recoilless rifles, and automatic grenade launcher fire. Moreover, a Russian T-80 tank is stationed nearby and rushes to repel the assault. Approaching Russian positions, Ukrainians get under heavy fire and tanks cover more vulnerable RAPs before almost simultaneously hitting landmines. It's also possible that they received ATGM hits or were hit by Russian tank, but the nature of the explosions hints at mines. Meanwhile, the Russian tank several times retreats and enters the battle again, pounding Ukrainians. RAPs that are forced to maneuver in a kill zone one by one hit mines as well. In a matter of 10 minutes, the entire Ukrainian column is obliterated. Soldiers of the 23rd Brigade, nevertheless, maintain order and help the wounded while getting into the closest trench. While the Russian command was cheering T-80 that seemingly repelled the attack, the 110th Territorial Defense Brigade attacks from the flank, forcing Russian armor to retreat from the village, while the soldiers of the 23rd Mechanized Brigade, after linking up with 110th, push Russian infantry from the village. The Ukrainian Volunteer Army Battalion also begins infantry skirmishes near Neskuchne, while the artillery and counter-battery fire ramps up across the whole front line. The first day of probing defenses shows that Russians act in a coordinated manner, and the scale of mining is indeed unthinkable. Ukrainians, however, used only a small fraction of their forces and still have plenty of reserves. What is a real problem is that such new units as the 23rd Mechanized Brigade still lack the organization and skills to perform well in an emergency, even though they acted bravely near Novodarivka. The significant losses of the equipment is a clear sign of that. On the next day, similar preliminary attacks continue on the whole southern front line, and in Klishivka, where Ukrainians also actively use tanks to pound Russian positions. Between 2:18 and 2:20 am local time on June 6, 2023, an enormous explosion rocks the area of Nova Kakhovka. At dawn, the rumors that started spreading right after the explosion turned out to be true. The large Kakhovka Dam was completely breached, and water from the second largest artificial reservoir in Ukraine rushed to the sea, bringing the average level of flooding in susceptible towns to 5.6 meters. The dam, that was designed to withstand a nuclear strike, could have been destroyed only by the explosion in inner tunnels that were controlled by Russia. As much as it is a humanitarian and ecological catastrophe, the dam breach also significantly affects the battlefield. The raised water level downstream makes it impossible for Ukrainian troops to launch an amphibious assault in the area of Kherson. This was likely one of the diversionary attacks pre-planned by Ukrainians, as an extremely similar operation happens in the area of Krinky village after the end of the counteroffensive. The dam collapse is likely the reason why it was postponed. Near Zaporizhia, the banks of the water reservoir turn into vast swamps, also bad for amphibious operations. Therefore, by some estimates, Russians are able to reinforce their main defensive lines with as many as 15,000 extra troops of such capable units as, for example, 810th Marine Brigade to counter the Ukrainian main attack. The attack that begins on the next day, June 7th. One column of the 33rd and 47th Mechanized Brigades leaves Malatokmachka and heads south, using narrow paths made with a few donated M58 Myklik and domestic Ur-77 remote demining vehicles. The M113s, MRAPs and Leopard 2s are slowly traversing through fields behind machines with mine plows. As the sun rises, they no longer can hide from Russian reconnaissance drones. One of the road turns becomes a bottleneck, and the vehicles that were as much spread out as possible have to gather in specific spot. Exactly at this moment, Russian artillery with drone assistance starts pounding this location with a barrage of deadly shells. At least a few Leopard 2s and other vehicles are damaged, while others are likely abandoned after hitting mines in attempts to escape a deadly trap. Eventually, the column pushes on, leaving the crossing while getting closer and closer to the Russian positions. However, they soon get under the heavy artillery fire again, and after losing even more armored vehicles, they have to turn back. Another column of the 47th Mechanized Brigade departs from the other part of Malatokmachka. This time, Leopard 2s are accompanied by M2 Bradley IFVs, much better protected and armed vehicles than M113s. However, the mine-clearing vehicles with mine rollers and plows are still necessary to clean up the path, so the formation is similar. This time, however, the bulk of the forces almost gets to the Russian positions, with the first mine-clearing vehicle reaching the tree line from which Ukrainians plan to attack. Suddenly, the ATGMs, grenade launchers and small arms fire open up from nearby bushes. Ukrainians, stuck in an open field, answer with Bradley autocannons and missiles, as well as tank shells into the invisible enemy. The BMR-2 mine-clearing vehicle is disabled most likely with ATGM, helicopter-launched missile or tank fire of the Russian armor from Quick Response Unit. Trying to escape the kill zone, Ukrainian Leopard 2 bypasses the mine-clearing vehicle, but immediately hits a landmine. Fearing the shock, they understand that the pass was cleared incompletely, or that Russians used the system of remote mining to litter it with landmines again. The Bradleys have no choice other than to pick up the crews of damaged vehicles and try to push on the relative safety. Another Bradley hits a landmine right behind the Leopard 2. In a few seconds, one more is disabled in the same way, right next to the tank. The Western IFVs, however, save the crew's lives, while the number of wounded and stranded troops ramps up. Facing prospects of complete destruction, Ukrainians open a suppressive small arms fire while fighting for their lives in this catastrophic situation. The command makes a decision to turn back to get as many people out as possible. One of the Bradleys makes a bold move by passing damaged vehicles and turning around just to hit another landmine. The same fate awaits another IFV that almost escapes after turning back, leaving behind at least one BMR-2, 4 Bradleys and 1 Leopard 2A6. Ukrainians retreat to Malatokmachka. During the assaults of the June 7th and 8th, Ukrainians also attack from Novodanilivka. This time, trying to make a wider path to enable easier maneuvering, they deploy 4 mine-clearing vehicles at once, 3 Leopard 2Rs and 1 Bergepanzer III recovery vehicle with a mine plow. This time, the column apparently lost a few vehicles due to mines, but the main means of destruction was artillery, as the area around is densely covered with craters. Once again, Russian drones have managed to spot Ukrainians early and direct fire, forcing them to abandon 2 Leopard 2A6, 1 Bradley, 2 Max Prom reps, and Bergepanzer III. The repeated attempts to attack from Novotokmachka also fail due to the deployment of Russian K-52s that hit Ukrainian vehicles with guided missiles. The ferocious assaults of June 7th and 8th will go into history as one of the toughest tactical offensives that Ukraine ever conducted, both in terms of the losses and complexity. Tearing through dense minefields while being under artillery strikes, helicopter-launched missiles, gliding bombs, loitering munitions, ETGMs, and grenade launchers became a routine for these 2 days, as a few featured in these video columns are only a fraction of all mechanized assaults on the narrow front line near Robotyne. Around 20% of the vehicles received from Ukraine's allies were damaged or destroyed, the most sensitive losses being at least 12 out of 100 M2 Bradleys and 6 Leopard 2s of different modifications out of 61. Vehicles that Ukraine possessed before the war also take hits. These losses, however, are not in vain. While everyone is shocked by the Western equipment destruction, the Russian defensive positions are obliterated and are slowly taken over by the Ukrainian infantry, which can now use paths in minefields to their advantage. To the west, Ukrainian 130th Separate Reconnaissance Battalion also manages to liberate Lobkova. The videos of the Russians walking next to damaged and destroyed Western equipment quickly disappear as more and more cases of successful vehicle recoveries surface. Leopard 2s not only take hits from all possible means of destruction, but also support infantry and score hits on Russian armor that is sent to plug the breakthrough. Ukrainian artillery is assisting the troops on the front line with active counter-battery fire, even though it also suffers losses, mainly from Lancet loitering munitions. Nevertheless, the Ukrainian command chooses to stop and rethink their approach. Ukrainians planned to reach Robotyne by June 7th, completely breaking through the first Russian defensive line. Instead, they suffered losses in armored vehicles that were not critical but unsustainable if we take into account that only a narrow part of the first defensive line was partially breached. Some may argue that this is because Ukrainians decided not to throw all their forces in this direction, but simultaneously put a pressure on Russians in different parts of the front line. This, however, is unlikely, since throwing even more vehicles on minefields would require more demining and will cause even higher losses. Moreover, Russians would be able to concentrate more troops near Robotyne, building up an even more significant numerical advantage. Commander-in-Chief of Armed Forces of Ukraine, Valery Zaluzhny, makes a hard decision to scrap earlier plans of fast mechanized assault that relied on Western equipment, which Ukrainians apparently do not possess in needed quantities. Instead, the attacks have to be conducted with groups of around 10 people, mostly infantry with IFVs and tanks in strictly supporting roles. This has to minimize losses of men and equipment, rendering ineffective Russian airstrikes, large artillery barrages, and a network of reconnaissance drones. On June 9th, the 47th and 33rd Brigades halt most of their attempts of deep breakthroughs through minefields. The 65th Brigade is deployed to assist them with infantry attacks that aim to capture obliterated by columns Russian positions. Ukrainians start slowly grinding through in the direction of both Robotyne and Verbove. In the area of Velika Novosilka, however, Ukrainians still aggressively attack in columns. Marines of the 37th Brigade use newly acquired AMX-10 RCs, accompanied by Oshkosh M-ATVs, RAPs, for rapid raids. They get closer to Novodonetsk, quickly getting through minefields and artillery barrages right to the village, and engaging in brutal assaults. By June 10th, 23rd, 110th, 31st and 35th Brigades breached Russian defenses in many places to get to Robotyne. In Novodonetsk, however, Ukrainians are forced to retreat and abandon 3 of their brand new wheeled tanks. The reasons for that: thin armor and vulnerable to anti-personnel mines wheels of the vehicle. Active battles for Neskuchna village come to an end. 7th Battalion RA of the Ukrainian Volunteer Army liberates the village on June 10th. The 137th Separate Battalion of the 35th Marine Brigade pushes Russians out of Blagodatne and Makarivka, while the 88th Separate Battalion defeats them in Storozhove, inflicting heavy losses on the Russian 60th Brigade there. The tactical breakthrough could be explained by Mokry Yaly River that crosses the region from north to south and makes it hard to establish a single defensive line. Russians blow up a dam on this river to hold the Ukrainian advance from left bank to right, but from the west, The pressure also increases with the liberation of Leopard. At the same time, meticulous infantry assaults near Robotyne continue to inflict significant losses on Russian troops, allowing Ukrainians to slowly move closer to the village. Obviously, the progress is nowhere near the initial plans of the Ukrainian command. But in these circumstances, Ukrainians no longer lose dozens of pieces of Western equipment in days and significantly reduce still quite high count of killed and wounded. Ukrainian missile strikes on June 10th and 12th with Storm Shadow missiles target dozens of Russian officers in Zalizny Port, Shaslivtsevo and Primorsk, where among others they killed Sergei Guryachov, chief of staff of the 35th Combined Arms Army. Near Velika Novosilka, Russians desperately counterattack on June 13th, but without much success as Ukrainian troops on the left bank of the river continue to assault enemy positions from the three sides. Ukrainians also completely switched to using small groups of infantry, supported and transported by a few armored vehicles. Near Pyatikhatki, Ukrainians encircled the Storm Ossetia unit, killing 300 members of it, including Ivan Gotyahov, the deputy commander. The unit is soon disbanded. By June 18th, the Ukrainian 128th Mountain Assault Brigade liberates Pyatikhatki, and some small progress is made by the 47th, 65th and 33rd Brigades near Robotyne. Ukrainians also ramp up the use of FPV drones. The lightweight, fast and precisely controlled, these are a perfect way to deliver explosives to the enemy positions and armor. Russians follow the suit, but still do not get as many successful hits as Ukrainians, judging from the lots of published videos. On June 22nd, Ukrainians conduct a long-range airstrike with Storm Shadow missiles, launched from Su-24s. The missiles damage Chongar Bridge, which serves as an important supply route for Russians in the Zaporizhzhia region. Russians quickly construct a pontoon bridge underneath, so the attack does not significantly decrease their defensive capabilities. What potentially might have had an effect is Prigozhin's immunity, when his PMC, that for a long time fought for control over Bakhmut, suddenly captures the Russian city of Rostov and tries to get to Moscow. We already have a separate video about that. However, in the end, Prigozhin takes a deal and gets blown up in his plane exactly 2 months after starting Wagner's insurrection. By June 25th, Ukrainian 31st Mechanized Brigade manages to push Russians from Rivnopil after tough assaults. Near Robotyne, the wedge that was initially created by mechanized forces expands, but very slowly due to use of small groups of infantry for attacks. The brutal combat there, sometimes in close quarters, is somewhat similar to relentless assaults near Bakhmut. There, Ukrainians slowly approach Kurdyumivka and Klishivka. As the second month of the counteroffensive begins, it becomes clear that both sides are stuck in a brutal combat with little to no gains, as neither side can establish a breakthrough. The heavy battles as well as artillery duels and drone strikes continue along the whole front line, but only certain positions change hands without any significant impact on the overall situation. Ukrainians also shot down the Russian K-52 on July 25th in the Donetsk region. On July 27th, Ukrainians enter Staromayorsk, concluding the second month of the offensive with a small victory. On a big scale, though, they still have to reach the first defensive line of the Russians in many areas. However, Ukrainians are determined to continue their attempts to advance, as their enemy is far from countering the offensive easily. The Russian units take significant losses, even though they are in defense, and focus all their efforts solely on the southern front line, almost since the start of the year, to prevent a breakthrough. Ukrainian brigades are also exhausted, so the gradual deployment of the reserves is not a surprise as the offensive enters its third month. Moreover, with fresh reserves, Ukrainians plan to finally reach Robotyne, one of the strong points of the Russian first defensive line. In addition to battered 47th, 33rd and 65th Mechanized Brigades, which were on the spearhead of the attack near Robotyne since the beginning, the 118th Mechanized is deployed. In the notorious mechanized assault, the 118th suffers heavy losses, driving too close to the positions of the 1430th Motorized Rifle Regiment, reinforced with 45th Spetsnaz and 810th Marine Brigades. After that, 47th come to the rescue, clearing positions and evacuating heavy losses of the 118th, which by some accounts lost over a dozen of tanks and armored vehicles, as well as commanding officer in the rank of major. This direction is also reinforced by elements of the 116th and 117th Mechanized Brigades, but they are likely were quite small in numbers at this point. On the morning of July 29, 2023, Ukrainian Su-24 successfully hit the railway bridge near Chonhar with Storm Shadow missiles. The second strike on August 6 damages Chonhar and Tonka Protoka bridges. The sign that Ukrainians are still determined to target Russian logistics, even though it's significantly harder to do than it was in previous two offensives. In the first half of August, the elements of the 46th Air Mobile Brigade are deployed near Robotyne, as well as 82nd Air Assault armed with Challengers 2s, Marders, and Strykers. Russians, at the same time, draw closer their reservist Bars units due to high losses and try to counterattack on the flanks of the created wedge in defense by the elite paratrooper brigades and regiments. The Russian helicopters also attack more aggressively, losing one K-52 on the August 7th near Robotyne and another on August 17th near Novoprokopivka. Since Russians started actively using OMPK bombs, which are regular munitions with attached wings for gliding and guidance systems, their attack aviation is out of range for short-range SAMs and manpads, so their losses in planes on this front were limited by a few cases of friendly fire. Ukrainian aviation also carries out CAS sorties, but in an extremely careful manner, as their enemy has significantly more assets for intercepting such attacks. Nevertheless, with the support of aviation and artillery, now armed with US cluster munitions, the 35th Marine Brigade routs the Russian 40th Marine Brigade from Urozhaine after weeks of assaults across the river from previously liberated Staromayorsk. The fighting escalates as Ukrainians first enter the outskirts of Robotyne on August 17th and push the adversary out of town by August 20th. The 1430th and 291st Motorized Rifle Regiments have to be withdrawn and replaced by the 1152nd Regiment due to extremely high losses. Russians relentlessly counterattack with their reserves concentrated here, but neither the extensive bombardments with hundreds of glide bombs nor infantry waves change the situation. At this point, Ukrainians broke through the first of the three defensive lines, raising their flag over a seemingly insignificant town that turned out to be one of the most well-defended strong points, not just in this war, but likely in the war history of 21st century. The scale of the defenses that Russians meticulously built in preparation is truly astonishing, and shows that they certainly learned a lot about static defense throughout this campaign. Most importantly, kilometers of minefields, continuous trenches and dragon tees, tank ditches and pillboxes are covered by the artillery and aviation, which are able to act quickly due to reconnaissance drone network, especially effective in this particular type of terrain. Meanwhile, a similarly static situation near Bakhmut also starts to change. After months of fighting, the 72nd Motor Rifle Brigade is depleted with constant losses and starts slowly losing ground at the beginning of September. By some accounts, the brigade was reduced to 100 soldiers or a single company after being encircled in Avdiivka. The reinforcements in the form of 31st and 83rd Air Assault Brigades arrive in time to back up falling apart unit, but under a brutal onslaught, they are also soon driven back. The fights in the ruins of villages prove to be costly for both sides, but Ukrainians prevail, with the 3rd Assault Brigade liberating Andriivka on September 15th and the 5th Loot Assault and 80th Air Assault Brigades capturing Klishchiivka on September 17th. These gains are actually possible since earlier in August, the 45th Artillery Brigade significantly degraded Russian logistics and the flow of mechanized reinforcements across the river crossings to the north of the town. The next month and a half can be summarized as a time of continued brutal assaults from both sides, fighting with small mobile infantry groups in kilometers of trenches and tree lines. Ukraine gains yet more ground around Robotyne, but does not move past it due to dogged resistance. Even though Russians fail all their attempts to turn the wedge in their first defensive line here into an encirclement, the area is still extremely dangerous, as it under a constant pressure of Russian aviation and ATGMs placed on the flanks of the quite narrow 10-kilometer corridor. The more significant Ukrainian tactical gains to the south of Velika Novosilka are still far from the strategic goals that were set up before the offensive. Thus, after 5 months of brutal assaults, the offensive slowly comes to an end, as Russians try to advance on the flanks of Avdiivka. Soon, the 47th Mechanized Brigade is redeployed there to counter massive Russian mechanized assaults that closely resemble what Ukrainians did at the beginning of their 2023 counteroffensive. Marine brigades are redeployed to the west in attempts to cross the river and establish a bridgehead in the left bank. Thus, December 1st may be seen at the end of the 5-month-long operation. The losses of both sides are quite hard to estimate. Being an offensive, Ukrainians had to lose more, but Russians, who quite successfully relied on their quantitative advantage in various military equipment, still have hardly changed their approach to the lives of soldiers. However, the vehicle losses are known due to enormous amount of footage. Note, however, that these numbers are for the time period between June 4th and December 1st, as well as from the whole front line, not just southern front. Verified by footage, Ukraine has lost 179 tanks, 56 armored fighting vehicles, 239 infantry fighting vehicles, and 104 armored personnel carriers. At the same time, Russia lost 499 tanks, 206 AFVs, 206 IFVs, and 63 APCs. What's interesting is that Ukraine lost more vehicles in the category of IFVs and APCs, which hints that these were the most used assets during the offensive. This makes sense, as above-mentioned swift assaults of small infantry groups are often transported and supported by these types of vehicles. The astonishing number of destroyed Russian tanks, however, is likely explained by the active use of the Ukrainian FPV drones, which became an extremely potent weapon. The tanks are the slowest and largest ones on the list, and are easier to spot, so no surprise they were targeted so violently. Worth mentioning that both sides switched to deep artillery and drone strikes after approaching the stalemate phase, so quite a significant number of artillery pieces were involved and destroyed. This is also true for air defense systems, but the real losses of such behind-the-line equipment are hard to estimate. Now, having a clear view of 3 major Ukrainian offensive operations this far, we can compare them and see why the first 2 significantly exceeded expectations and routed Russians while the 2023 counteroffensive did not. Ukrainians clearly tried to replicate the most successful scenario, which was the Kharkiv counteroffensive, so let's discuss this one first. This table depicts the crucial advantages that both sides had. Obviously, more advantages lead to military victory. At the beginning of Kharkiv counteroffensive, Ukrainians managed to indirectly convince the Russian command that they are going to solely focus on recapture of Kherson. Therefore, Russians moved a lot of forces to the right bank of the Dnieper River, where they were blocked by frequent attacks on bridges with HIMARS missiles. This leads to the Ukrainians having simply more troops near Kharkiv than Russians. At the same time, these troops were among the most experienced brigades that faced the enemy from the first days of the invasion. Maintaining an advantage in reconnaissance drones as well as morale, they were ideal forces for swift and aggressive operation. Utilizing the element of surprise, they strike fast and in places where Russians are the least prepared. This allows them to move quickly. At the same time, Russians had an advantage in pieces of equipment and ammunition. They also do not fully control the skies due to Ukrainian abundant SAM systems and manpads, but still have significant advantages in the number of planes and quality of the attack aviation in general. However, the high speed of the Ukrainian advance due to element of surprise made directing airstrikes impossible. Moreover, the above-mentioned Ukrainian advantages already outweighed the adversary ones, triggering a rout, so the Russians started losing their equipment and ammunition in large numbers, which pretty much reduced to zero all their chances to resist effectively. Now, let's try to analyze the 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive in the same way. First of all, Ukraine no longer had an element of surprise. We can blame Ukrainian officials, media and journalists or military command, but the fact is that long before the counteroffensive started, everyone knew where it will begin. To be fair, it's not like Ukrainians had a lot of choices, as attacking on the south and trying to cut the land corridor to Crimea is the only strategic goal that can turn the tide of war at this point. Moreover, learning from the past mistakes, Russians through trade with China got their hands on plenty of reconnaissance drones, as well as started mass production of Lancet loitering munitions and FPV drones. Therefore, no element of surprise, not only on strategic, but also on the tactical level. While the morale of the Ukrainian troops remained pretty much the same and still counts as a significant advantage, many new brigades received training in NATO countries, as well as new equipment. These are very complex advantages, as some things, such as tactical medicine or skills related to Western equipment, were indeed extremely important for Ukraine. However, by accounts of many soldiers, training related to infantry and vehicle maneuvers, as well as the use of drones, did not apply to the modern battlefield. Many brigades used on the spearhead of the attack were new units that still had problems with the effective use of drones and coordination. The new equipment, such as Leopard 2 and Challenger 2 MPTs, Bradley and Marder infantry fighting vehicles, performed well, but their numbers were such small that they did not have much of an effect on the battlefield against hundreds of inferior Russian machines. On the other hand, Ukraine stockpiled a lot of ammunition and was already pretty comfortable using Western artillery systems, which was a huge advantage throughout the offensive. Let's now look at how Russians prepared for the Ukrainian counteroffensive. First of all, without an element of surprise on the Ukrainian side, Russia developed a new advantage that stems from the still present abundance of Soviet equipment, the landmines. Covering the whole front line with a huge minefields was possible as Ukrainian allies for a long time were indecisive and reluctant to allocate necessary equipment, even in the small numbers that were later provided. This allowed Russians to create minefields and trench systems of such a scale that no fast breakthrough would be possible, even with the best mechanized forces. After successful mobilization, the Russian army also has an advantage in the number of people who are not the best troops but are trained enough to fill the trenches behind the vast minefields and simply hold them. This preemptively renders impossible a speed advantage that was imperative in the Kharkiv counteroffensive. The new Russian high-precision gliding bombs, called UMPK, allowed them to pound the Ukrainian static positions while being out of range for manpads and short-range SAMs. Due to terrain, Russian attack helicopters also became relevant weapons against any mechanized assault. As we mentioned before, some Ukrainian advantages are quite controversial, so in the long term, they are rendered ineffective by Russian ones. On the west front lines and in the dense minefields, small groups of Western MBTs and IMVs make little difference. Ukraine received only an insignificant number of demining equipment to make passes in minefields, so specifically prepared for the swift assaults, mechanized forces have to move cautiously and support infantry under the constant strikes of Russian aviation, helicopters and ATGMs. As the counteroffensive drags in, the Ukrainian ammunition stockpiles accumulated for the relatively fast breakthrough are eventually exhausted. The troops, trained in Western countries, maintain morale throughout heavy battles, but cannot apply skills related to the fast breakthrough that was expected. The new units are forced to solve coordination issues right in the middle of the battles, ultimately becoming stronger and more battle-hardened, at the same time losing men due to mistakes that experienced brigades would not make. All this effectively reduces the advantages that Ukrainians had initially by half, creating conditions in which not even fast but hardly any breakthrough would be either extremely costly or simply impossible. In conclusion, the Ukrainian 2023 counteroffensive reached only a few of its tactical but no strategic goals, even though significant forces were involved. The losses of the men and equipment, quite high for the recaptured area, were still not critical, as Ukraine have managed to immediately switch to other offensive and defensive operations after the end of the counteroffensive. Together with that, many new brigades of the 10th Army Corps received a crucial battle experience that can be passed on to new members. The offensive also showed that Russians are slowly learning and seeking the way to capitalize on already made gains due to their inability to start their own strategic offensive. Such an approach leads the war in Ukraine into the positional trench warfare that is a dead end, according to the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Valery Zaluzhny. He also concludes that the new kind of weapons are necessary to change that. If from standpoint of Russia they already utilize all their tools, Ukraine still has a space to grow. For example, the 2023 campaign showed the immense potential of FPV drones and the importance of complete control over the skies. Ukraine has yet to get F-16 fighter jets from allies and actively expanding its domestic drone production. These two things have the potential to become next game changers, to which Zaluzhny referred, and at least partially reshape the battlefield in 2024.